which I'm extremely grateful for as well. So in general, very grateful and very pleased that you can tell us about your work on North Queensland vowels. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to turn my video off in just a second, but just so everybody can see me for a second, I'm currently in Puckapunyal. Those of you who are Australian, or even if you are and have no idea what that is, it's a small town an hour north of Melbourne. If for any reason my audio quality disintegrates, that is because we don't have great internet out here. So please let me know in the chat if something's muffled or if a slide doesn't come through properly, so that I can repeat it. And I'll try to make sure that I go nice and slowly so that I am very nice and clear. I'm going to share my screen now of the PowerPoint that we are looking at today. So today I'm going to be talking about regional vowel characteristics of Northern Queensland speakers. As Maria has let you know, I have moved around quite a bit my post-PhD career, and part of that is because my husband is in the army, and so where he goes I follow, and that's given me a lot of opportunities to perhaps work in places where linguistics is not so well known, and specifically the type of linguistics in terms of instrumental phonetics is less readily available. So we moved to Townsville a number of years ago, and I spent 3 years up there. And whilst I was employed by the speech pathology department to teach phonetics to their first year students, I noticed some really interesting things. And I think that when you are working in an area like that, you can't turn your brain off. It doesn't really matter if the course content is one thing, your research brain continues to think, why are they doing that? That is really interesting. So a lot of the work from today comes out of that period of time. And I should let you know that this work is ongoing. It is very preliminary, the results that I'm presenting today, and that hope is in the future, together with Maria and James, that some further work on this part of regional Australia could be undertaken. So when we're thinking about Australian English, most of the descriptions we have of Australian English are focused predominantly in the major metropolitan centres. So Sydney, for example, has got a lot of research done about the way that people speak there. Victoria, and in particular Melbourne, or Melbourne, however you would like to say it, has also had significant amounts of work. And this is particularly in part because of the types of researchers and the types of institutions that are in these positions. It's easy to go and get participants for studies when you are surrounded by those participants. However, other areas of Australia, and Australia is big, as we all know, and quite isolated, a lot less work has been done. So there has been some work done in regional Australia, say in regional Victoria or in regional New South Wales. But aside from that, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a bit, there really hasn't been a lot done. So when I arrived in Townsville and started work in a speech pathology area, and I was teaching the students obviously how to phonetically transcribe, you know, speech, Australian speech. And I gave them these exercises to do. And as I was marking, there was a common problem. And that common problem was that the at vowel, the trap vowel, and the vowel were consistently across students, we had 30 to 40 in each year group, would consistently transpose those, so that you would have a sentence or a word like and they would pronounce it as end or transcribe it as end. And I thought, that's interesting. That's not normally something that I've had to choose with teaching before. And then also other sounds like L versus the L. And coming from Victoria with that well-known Melbourne versus Melbourne interesting feature that is happening down here, it was certainly something that raised my interest. So when we're thinking about accent variability in Australian English, obviously people have worked in this field before quite extensively. There's quite a bit of research that has occurred and is occurring. In terms of HBD environments, obviously we've got Rosie's nice paper about regional differences between Melbourne, Sydney and Adelaide, amongst others. We've also got interesting papers in pre-natural environments. We know that vowels in pre-lateral environments are prone to doing some interesting things. So both in New Zealand English, but also pre-lateral in Victoria, that we know not in New South Wales. And then the issue of prenasal environments. We know that lots of dialects of English demonstrate this allophonic raising and fronting. And that Sydney female speakers, some Palathorpe have found this as well. However, outside of these areas, we really don't have a great idea about how Australians speak. The Austalk corpus is obviously one way in which phoneticians and linguists in general have tried to increase the amount of corpus data that allows us to look at not just the larger metropolitan centres, but in general, when we talk about Australian English, we're really talking about something that has come from descriptions of, say, Sydney in general. So what I really wanted to do was to provide some very preliminary experimental data for young North Queensland speakers. Now, North Queensland is an interesting place. I don't know how many of you have ever been to North Queensland. They are often in the news because of their desire to be a separate country or a separate state. They like to stand apart from the rest of Australia. They like to stand apart from the rest of Queensland, to be honest. If you live up there and they say, I'm going south, they mean they're going to Brisbane. It is geographically very distinct from the rest of Queensland. So it is the same distance between Melbourne to Brisbane as it is from Brisbane up to Townsville. So if you're just thinking about geographic distance, there is a lot happening in between there. It's often sparsely populated. Townsville is an interesting case because it's one of the major metropolitan centres for that area. It's got the hospital, the university, and obviously, in my case, the Defence Force. But people who live up there often stay living up there. So if you come into university, it's because you are often going to go back into other rural areas in northern Queensland. All of these things play into theories about language differentiation and some other things that we'll be talking about later. So I just want to have you have that in the back of your mind as we explore what's happening in northern Queensland, because it's socially not like the rest of Australia in a lot of ways, and therefore it provides a really interesting place in order to gather data that can actually help us explore what the Australian landscape is in terms of vowel space. So the aim of this very small scale study was a geographic comparison to provide some data, hopefully for in the future for longitudinal studies. But also I was working in a speech pathology department to have some type of data available in terms of clinic. So these training speech pathologists about what is the norm in terms of vowel space. That's very hard to do if the norms are based on vowels that are from Sydney and that people are making certain types of changes in their speech and they're doing it consistently, and we can say that that's a North Queensland variety. Those kinds of things play out in clinic by saying that's a difference, not a disorder. So part of this was also to start to have some thinking about along those lines and make sure that we're feeding back into people who can use this data in terms of actual, I suppose, meaty content for their profession. So the very basic research questions were, what are the form and frequency values for Northern Queensland speakers? Are there some differences between Northern Queensland speakers of Australian English and speakers from other states? Is there evidence of this L-L merger? I know this is the case in, say, Victoria, but not in South Wales. And is there evidence for these speakers an allophonic split for oral and nasal? Now, obviously, I had some presuppositions coming into collecting this data. I had noticed some things. So I was expecting that there possibly would be some differences from Northern Queensland speakers. Northern Queensland speakers are often maligned as having either very broad accents, or somebody comes from kind of the redneck part of the state. So I think there is a perception from the rest of Australia that we can tell when somebody is from somewhere not Sydney, not Melbourne. Knowing what we do about the LL merger, I had my hypothesis that we would see something happening, whether it's on level of happening in Melbourne or not, remains for us to have a look at in a moment. So when we come to the data, we have 10 female participants and 7 males, aged between 17 and 22. They were all related to the university in some type or manner of way. They were all born in Australia. They had lived in Northern Queensland for at least 10 years and had done all of their schooling, basically all of their schooling in Northern Queensland. They self-described as Northern Queenslanders, which is something that I want to talk about in a little bit as well. To give you an idea of what they sound like, this is one of the females.
10. Telly. Hard. 10.
And one of the males.
Head, sand, end, shall, send.
I hope you can hear, even from that small portion of recording that we just had, that there is something interesting happening in some environments for these speakers. So we're going to be talking about the vowel space in general today, but also about the particular environments that might condition some changes.
10. Telly.
Head.
So in terms of methodology, to be comparable with what other people have been doing in the HBD condition, these participants read from a flashcard. We were in a sound.
Sorry, Adele, you have a question on the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chloe's asking, was he saying shall or shall? He was saying shall. Yeah, it's pretty, and yeah, telly or tally. He was actually, I can go back to that screen and I'll play it again for you.
Head, sand, end, shall, send.
So, and the speaker.
10. Telly.
She's tally.
Hard. 10.
And as you can hear, their vowel space seems to be slightly different from what you would possibly expect from, say, a Sydney speaker. So as soon as you hear them talk, your mind's starting to go. There are some elements that sound more Victorian, but there's some elements that sound more steady in terms of possibly that raising before a nasal. So I got them to just do some very low-key sound recordings, as you've heard. So HVD conditions, and then prelateral and prenasal. So similar to Rosie and Felicity have done in the past, and also what Debbie has done with her laterals and nasals. Very simply processed it through mouse, hand corrected with any misaligned formants. There is a large amount of nasalization in a number of the speakers, especially obviously through those nasal vowels. Obviously, that meant that some things were misaligned. I haven't had a chance yet to really investigate some nasalization effects which have been raised. Something interesting to look at in the future. I've just done some very simple formant plots for the Northern Queensland data based on mean F1 and F2 values. And just to reiterate, these are preliminary results. We really don't have enough speakers, don't have enough iterations. However, I think they're indicative of future trends that we will see when I get the chance to record some more speakers. So here's our list of words, just so you have a good chance to have a look at it. We've got our normal suspects over there on the left. We've got our pairs of prelateral environments, so shell versus shall, pellets, pallet, ellie and alley. And then the same for the nasal environment, so send versus sand. These were randomly intermixed. So occasionally you would get one that would come out directly against the other. But even when that happened occasionally, you couldn't really tell them apart for some speakers. So I'm going to look at the comparisons in each of these conditions. So just looking at the HVD, I'm doing a very simple comparison with the mean formant frequencies for Melbourne and Sydney, and visual comparisons with Adelaide based on those published results. In the prelateral and prenasal conditions, looking at means and standard deviations for each vowel in each condition, and doing just some simple t-tests. Now, obviously, we can do a lot more, but probably once we have some more data. So in terms of the HVD conditions, Townsville, so Northern Queensland, is represented in the red. And hopefully you can see immediately that their vowel space is different. These are the female speakers. And I think the things to note most obviously are the extremities of the vowel space. These are very pulled. So they're being pushed to the margins of the vowel space. So we've got that at vowel down the bottom, and it is very low. That E vowel up the top is very much with a very high F2, and or vowel at the back is with a very low F2. So we've got a lot of in terms of our triangle rather than quadrilateral, if you want to talk about it that way, that each of those points is being pulled to the margins and clearly differentiated from each other. In terms of some of the other features that are interesting to see in terms of the comparison with, say, Melbourne, Adelaide and Sydney, those two hard vowels are sticking much closer. They're very back, very retracted, so much more akin to, say, Melbourne than they are to, say, Sydney. Another interesting feature to note is the or, the chord vowel, which is very raised comparative to the three other places of comparison. If we do just a very simple statistical significance tests, just comparing where these vowels are with some tricky post hoc tests. The ones highlighted in green, statistically significant, and as you can see, almost every vowel is different from either Sydney or from Melbourne. The one exception is hood, which sits fairly neatly within what we would expect from an Australian accent. If we have a look at those, we can see that Northern Queensland female speakers are more likely to have an F2 that is more similar to Melbourne due to its lack of statistical significant difference there, and it is more likely to be different from Sydney. I find that quite interesting, just geographically, I suppose, that the two extremities of the country are doing similar things, but Sydney is doing its own thing in the middle there. I think there's some things that need to get unpacked in that regard about maybe prestige values, some other things as well, which we'll have a look at when we've had a look at the men. If anybody has any questions about the women, I'll just pause for a second, and if you'd like me to back a screen, let me know.
Sorry, oops, I just sent my question through on the chat, but it's actually not about, you can wait till afterwards to answer it, Adele. Sorry.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
So in terms of the male space, what we see is something slightly different from the females. And we know from past papers and past research that men and women often do something slightly different, and that there are gender differences within Australian English. But there are some commonalities, and those are particularly seen in those vowels, so in E and in OR, where the vowel space has again been extended and really stretched at the margins. The had vowel is more raised than what we would have expected just from looking at the women's data. However, it's also retracted, but then the whole vowel space is retracted comparative to Sydney and Melbourne. Interesting features are again that hard vowel pair that are higher than what we would anticipate seeing Sydney and Melbourne's data values, but more similar again to Melbourne, where they are retracted in the vowel space. If we look at their significance, statistical significance, again we see that the vowel space is more like Melbourne than like Sydney, with more statistical difference happening between Sydney and Northern Queensland. But we do see that there is still quite a bit of difference in a number of areas. So I think from these very brief results of the HVD conditions, yes, David, it does seem to me that the men are behaving differently. The men have raised vowels while the women have lowered vowels. Both of them seem to have retracted vowels. Well, at least the back half retracted, both the men and the women do, whereas for the women, their front vowels all seem to be, the vowel space should just be acoustically bigger, I suppose, is a way to talk about it. I think the results, as preliminary as they are good preliminary results, because they say there's something interesting going on here. There is something to explore here. Is this a Northern Queensland thing? Is this A regional issue is what is happening. Is this a young people thing? The reason for the selection of these participants was that they were comparable to those other studies, to Billington's and Cox's studies, which were also done with young people. In Queensland, people go to university very early, as in aged early, because they finish school at 16, 17. So most of my first years, 17 or 18, which is the same age as, say, year 11 and year 12 students, say, in New South Wales or Victoria. The hope is to sample other age groups to see, is this a change over time, or is this just the way that Northern Queenslanders speak in general? And we've anecdotally known this, but we haven't actually had any data to support our findings. So I think we can say that Northern Queensland has a unique vowel space. These differences are at the extremities, the main ones at the extremities of the vowel space, but almost all vowels exhibit some type of difference. This is not just the case of one vowel being different, it's a case of a lot of the vowels being quite different. So we can talk about the low vowels, that hard. So we've got retraction similar to Melbourne English, but even more extensive. We've got the high back vowel, which is retracted, and the high front vowel, which is raised. We definitely have differences that are present in gender to different extents between male and females. And these characteristics are not uniformly distributed. So it's not just that all men do things and all women do things, or that all Northern Queenslanders do things, but in some ways, some women do things and some men do things as well. Jonathan, yes, there is some lexical differences, not in Northern Queenslanders often have a different lexical pattern than Victoria. So I'm thinking of things like words for swimmers and things like that. They have different words. They have the same lexical pattern, but they often vary from New South Wales in the same, for the same terms, if that makes sense. So I know Rosie's gone. I know that other people have a lot other more expertise in the answer about lexical distribution. So I might leave that to them for in the comments as well. Yes, Chloe, Jerry does do work on Perth and in Brisbane, and that's definitely one of the areas that we want to explore in the future. So when we have a think about which variety are they more related to or closely related to, I'd say that Northern Queensland is more closely related to Melbourne variety as compared to Sydney. So previous felicities found that New South Wales is becoming more open and attracted, and the female speakers in Northern Queensland do this, but not the male speakers. And in a lot of other ways, the Northern vowel space is significantly different to the Melbourne variety than the Sydney variety. So those are that's our kind of standard vowel space. But what about in the conditions that we know predispose a lot of varieties of English to some interesting features and to some interesting changes? So we're talking about prelateral and prenasal environments. We know that prelaterally interesting things happen in a lot of varieties of English, including Melbourne English. So what we've got here is some vowel ellipses in the HVD condition, that's on the most left, the prelateral condition, that's the middle, and the prenasal environment, that's the right hand, and we've got female on the left and male on the right. And so what we can see here is that obviously in the HVD conditions, we would expect little to no overlap. They are two separate phonemes, they function that way. And we would expect overlap, and we would expect a fairly tight vowel ellipse. This is with 95% confidence intervals. When we have a look at the lateral condition, so that's the one in the middle for both the females and the males, what we see is that we've got quite a bit of overlap of those vowel ellipses, even though the centroids are still significantly separate, and we'll talk about that in a bit, that there is a lot more overlap. You can also see, especially for the et vowel, so that the ellipses are much larger, indicating a lot more variety in terms of production. Some people are producing, still quite set kind of et sound, while others are definitely producing much more down towards that a kind of variety. The next plot is of those nasals. Those nasal conditions, we can see there is a complete merge. There is, they're sitting right over the top of each other, and in fact, the at vowel centroid is actually above that. What we end up with, therefore, is a loss of contrast in that situation prenasally, which is what, as a southern speaker, I hear when I listen to Northern Queenslanders. I hear a collapse in terms of what they are producing. So you might be wondering, yes, Adele, that's nice, but aren't there other ways in which we maintain contrast? And obviously I got that too, which is a good thing. So I looked at duration. Again, we've got the HPD condition on the left, the lateral condition in the middle, and nasal condition on the right. And what we see is that on the left, in the HPD condition, we would expect there to be a significant difference in terms of vowel length for these two vowels in Australian English. We see the same within the HVL. But what we see for the nasal condition is also a significant difference between the length, but also that length of that at vowel, that had vowel, prenasally has increased almost to the mean up to 300 milliseconds. So it's almost doubled in length prenasally. It's not something, as a southerner, I find myself either replicating or able to perceive massively well, but Northern Queenslanders anecdotally have, as I haven't run any perceptual tests like quantitatively for them, are able to pick the difference as a result. So whilst in terms of the vowel ellipses, we can say that there is a collapse of those two different vowels in terms of their F1 and F2 space. They're actually still being maintained as separate based on what kinds of duration they're providing. In terms of the prelateral environments, I think the results bear out my presuppositions that there is something happening here, but that it is a state of flux. And so prelaterally, we can see that that is lowered, and this happens for both male and female. So this is one of those areas in which men and women pattern the same. There's also a degree of retraction, which is what we would expect based on previous work done on Australian English. And there's this increasing level of overlap, but there's also this increased variability that shows itself in those larger vowel ellipses. So looking at individual speakers, I found that 30% of speakers don't maintain a differentiation, and other speakers do. So similar to some of the things that Debbie has started to find, and others, Chloe included, and lots of other people, that some speakers do it all the time, some speakers seem to do it some of the time, and some speakers don't do it at all. This is a too small a group of speakers to kind of make some grandiose statements about what Northern Queenslanders in general are doing. But in terms of what we can see just from these 17 speakers is that there's category distinctiveness is being maintained, but there is some variability and trends of it lowering, and that for some speakers this ends up with production that within the F1, F2 space is sounding pretty similar to each other. In terms of prenasally, both men and women are exhibiting some that raising. It's also becoming more fronted as comparative to, say, when it was in a HVD condition. So people are keeping their pronunciations distinct, not necessarily utilising the F1, F2 space, but by utilising durational differences, by making that the at vowel, which is normally longer than the et vowel anyway, but making it super long to make sure that the distinction is maintained. So that's kind of where we're up to at the moment. As you can imagine, working with a population that's just starting to be studied, there's so many things to do next. It's a little bit hard to know where to start. Looking at some of those visualization effects, I see from David, looking at monophthongal versus why is near included in lots of monophthongs. Is it regarded monophthongs in Australia? There's a lot of work to have a look at the onglides of some of these vowels. Are they long? Are they doing some interesting things based on being more like diphthongs? What are their trajectories like? So that's something that I'm planning on looking at. Looking at durations, obviously looking at some non-word list data. A lot of the research coming out of Jerry Doherty's work in Perth is on non-word list data, and so being able to compare with that. Yeah, we know a fair bit about the settlement patterns of Northern Queensland, as where speakers came from, and in kind of what numbers in the ethnic mix. We do know quite a lot of people, predominantly British. It was not penal colonies up there, a relatively late settlement for Australia comparative to, say, Melbourne. But settled along the coast before heading inland. There is some significant gold deposits just outside of town, actually, at Charters Towers, and so had a lot of exchange in the world at one point in the late 1800s, which I still find quite amazing because Charters Towers is tiny and in the middle of nowhere. Socially, it stands apart. There's a lot of, it had a different migratory pattern than, say, Melbourne or Sydney, and this is definitely something that needs to be sorted out in terms of what other social and linguistic functions are impacting speech production. I was surprised, somebody who has to move a lot and who used to different areas, I was surprised at the geographic stability of a lot of people who live in Northern Queensland. They might move from location to location in Northern Queensland, but they don't leave Northern Queensland, if that makes sense. A lot of people come from a town considered a large town at 170,000. And it's surrounded by smaller towns, but things are a long way apart. It's not like in Victoria where there's another town 5, 10, 15 minutes down the road. It's a 2 or 3 hour drive to really go anywhere. So looking at in the future collecting data from different age groups to see those kinds of things, but also utilising what, extend. That any better? Hopefully it is not.
Sorry to interrupt for a second here, Adele, but the sound has gone quite bad. And Chloe has also indicated the same thing. So it was going pretty well up, and Maria the same. It was going pretty well up until you got into this last slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can fix that in a second.
Okay. So while you're fixing that, maybe we'll just look at the, I was just thinking, look at the last
Yes.
slide. But yeah, I'll leave you
Pull
to.
that back. Oh, where's it gone?
So if everyone just hangs around for a moment.
Sorry, I'm hoping that will be better, but I don't know if it is.
Well, it is right at the moment.
Okay, well let's go when it's still working. I changed which setting it was, so hopefully that will work. All right, hopefully everybody can hear that for the moment. Sorry about that. It's pouring out here, and all the pits that the workers are working on in Ben are getting flooded. So basically, what's next for us is currently looking at providing larger groups and looking at not just vowel space and looking at other ways that Northern Queenslanders are different. So this includes things like looking at questions of identity and how they view themselves. Northern Queenslanders often view themselves as separate to the rest of Australia in terms of where their allegiance lies. So first to their region and definitely to their part of the state before they would say that they're Australian. Anecdotally, this is something that we would like to test in the future, some social linguistic kind of questions. When we come to settlement in Northern Queensland, it's an interesting case. It was settled very sporadically, so not like mass waves of migration in some other parts of Australia. So it developed independently from the rest of, say, Queensland, especially the southeast, which plays into the reasons why they view themselves the way that they do. I think obviously we've got some questions about nasalization effects. I've got some big questions about diphthongization in the Northern Queensland accent. So going back and having a look at the HVB environment and looking at glides and these kinds of things. Obviously, all of this requires further work and further research and further speakers. And I think it's a great impetuous for people to do research where you find yourself. I never thought I would move to Northern Queensland. Look, there's some interesting things happening there that I would not have expected as a linguist. So I'm really hoping that this type of research will lead to a better and a broader understanding of the way that the Australian English dialect is shaping, where it kind of fits in terms of world Englishes, and to do any of the longitudinal studies that we want to do in the future to see if there are regional differentiation, whether there's longitudinal trends, and we need to have the data first. So that's really the hope from this kind of work. So in conclusion, Northern Queenslanders really do speak in a way that's different from other regions of Australia. It's not just our made up bigotry about how they speak there up north. Their extremities of the vowel space are very expanded, particularly in the women, but also for some of the men. There's no merger at this time in terms of the prelateral environment, but there's definite evidence of that air lowering, a lot of variability prelaterally. There is raising and increased duration of that trap vowel prenatally, and this is indicative, I think, of an allophonic split in the production of the nasalized and oral a. There's a large amount, I think we always do this, there's a large amount of individual variation for these speakers. Yes, Chloe, my participant report a Townsville accent. They report a Northern Queensland accent. They never knew they had one until they might have gone on a holiday to, say, Melbourne or Sydney, which is a really big deal. It's a long way away. And people would say, oh, you don't come from around here. So I think even within this group of subjects, there's people who you wouldn't pick out in a crowd, I suppose. But as a whole, we can see that the Northern Queenslanders are doing something different from some of the other regions that we've studied in Australia before. And that provides us with great opportunity to understand a little bit more about what the Australian accent looks like for more people in Australia. So thank you for your time. Thank you for putting up with my internet. I hope it has been illuminating, and I will be sticking around to answer any questions.